Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is, sorry, one second, unplugged myself. My name is Sarah Reeves, and I'm the marketing manager for New Society Publishers. We thank you for joining us today for the book launch of What's Up with White Women by Ilsa Govan and Tilman Smith. In keeping with Indigenous culture and to build respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, we acknowledge that our office is located on the traditional, unceded territory of the Nanaimo First Nation, the keepers of this land since time immemorial. As settlers, it's important to recognize that although we call this place home, the Nanaimo First Nation never ceded their lands to the Crown. An integral part of New Society's mission and vision has been to publish books for a world of change in a way that has a minimal impact on our environment to help build a just and ecologically sustainable society. For this work to remain authentic and meaningful, we acknowledge our settler privilege and understand the impact it has had on the land and Indigenous peoples. You can find out more about New Society and how we put people and planet first at newsociety.com. What's Up with White Women book launch is our first virtual event of the season, and we thank you for being here. While this topic may bring up some challenging feelings, we want this to remain a safe, inclusive, and healthy space for conversation. Please be mindful of the tone and content of your questions, and note that we will not tolerate racism, sexism, homophobia, hate speech, discrimination, or contributions that could be interpreted as such. Please refer to our full event code of conduct for more details, which will be posted in the chat. We will be turning the chat function off during the presentation, but we will have time for questions at the end, so please post them in the Q&A section. And just a note that we will choose a winner for the book for What's Up with White Women from the people who post questions in the chat. So, or sorry, not in the chat, in the Q&A section. So please post your questions there. We're also offering a 25% discount to attendees with the code WOMEN25, which can be redeemed at newsociety.com. Again, welcome to the book launch for What's Up with White Women, Unpacking Sexism and White Privilege in the Pursuit of Racial Justice with authors Ilsa Govan and Tilman Smith in conversation with Delbert Richardson and Lisa Doy. When tackling topics of systemic racism, it can be easy to build narratives surrounded around white men and toxic masculinity. But white women have long been actively complicit in upholding these systems of white supremacy throughout history, from actively buying and selling enslaved people in the 1800s to currently engaging as 1 million strong women in white supremacy movements. We cannot skirt around naming the gendered roles of white women in systemic racism if we, as a society, hope to dismantle systems of oppression. We need to make space for deeper understanding and calls for action. And Seattle racial justice educators and activists Ilsa Govan and Tilman Smith offer such a space in their new book, What's Up with White Women, Unpacking Sexism and White Privilege in Pursuit of Racial Justice. This book launch event will feature a conversation between the authors and two visionary historians, Lisa Doy, community organizer with Tsuru for Solidarity, and Delbert Richardson, community scholar and founder of the Unspoken Truths American History Museum. We'll explore the historic and current role of white women in relation to the anti-oppression work being led by these organizations, as well as illuminate patterns of behavior present in white women that both uphold and undermine their efforts. Ilsa has extensive experience as an anti-racist facilitator, consultant, leadership coach, and activist. As co-founder of Cultures Connecting, she has helped countless organizations put their vision of racial equity into practice. Her facilitation superpower is guiding white people in examining how we've internalized racism in our assumptions and actions. And Tilman Smith has been an educator, project manager, and racial justice consultant for over 35 years, serving as a classroom teacher, college instructor, caucus facilitator, trainer, and coach. She has facilitated workshops and caucuses throughout the country on the topics of racial equity, white privilege, internalized sexism, and internalized white superiority. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Ilsa and Tilman.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I like to believe that your book is marked, like I saw the tabs in your book, that it's marked in that way because of all the important points that you've been taking as you're reading it, and not just how you're trying to promote it. So
No, it's exactly. They're all the ones that made me go, oh, really? I think just those aha moments. So
wonderful. Thank you so much. Real big appreciation to New Society Publishers. We are so delighted to be in partnership with you in this work because we know that your values as a publisher align with our values for social and environmental justice, down to the ink that you use to print the book. And so it's so delighted to be in partnership with you and appreciate you hosting this event. And really excited to be here. I'm Ilsa, pronouns she, her, with Tilman Smith, Lisa Doy, and Delbert Richardson. And Tilman invited me, where did this book come from is a question that we get a lot. You know, we've been doing racial justice work for a long time, and we've known each other through circles doing racial justice work. And a special shout out to the White Privilege Conference, which has been instrumental in many of the networks and connections that we made that made this book possible. And Tilman said, hey, there's some things that we need to talk about, right? And we'd been hearing this question from people of color, like, what's up with white women? And then asking us, what's up with you? Like, why are you showing up in the way that you are? And so we wanted to get together and talk about this in a way where we see ourselves in this work. And so the title isn't just, you know, those other white women and we're the authors, we're the experts, we don't have any work to do. That we really are wrestling with our own stories and how we show up and how we continue to show up as interfering with racial equity work or helping to promote racial equity work. And so we intentionally do that in partnership and in collaboration with one another because we want to counter the dynamics of white supremacy and sexism that have taught us that as white women, we need to be competing with one another to get to the top. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tilman Smith.
Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Tilman Smith. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the co-author of What's Up with White Women. And I would love to invite Lisa and Delbert to join us with your wonderful selves. So, because I would love people to just see the four of us as we're in conversation. One of the things that Ilsa and I talked a lot about as the book was getting finished, and we were lucky enough to be working with New Society, was the responsibility of being two white people, two white women writing a book, and where did the proceeds go from that book? And we decided that we wanted to make sure that the proceeds went to two organizations that we both held very dear and we're in relationship with. And so we are in the company of two people this evening that represent those two organizations. Both will present something about their work that they do, and then we'll come together and have a conversation, the four of us, and then open it up for questions from the audience. So let me start with Lisa Doy. Lisa is the fourth generation in her family to make a home in Chicago. She's currently an organizer with Tsuru for Solidarity and a curatorial assistant with the Japanese American National Museum. Locally, she's the president of the Japanese American Citizens League in Chicago and a member of the Midwest Buddhist Temple. Lisa has completed MA research on Japanese American residential patterns in Chicago, and she's currently a doctoral student in American Studies with an interest in public memory, imagination, and archives, and the role of repair and history. Lisa, welcome, and we look forward to hearing about you and Tsuru for Solidarity.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'll just talk really briefly about what Tsuru for Solidarity is, which is brief because we're a fairly new organization. Tsuru was founded in 2019 by a group of Japanese Americans who really began and sort of coalesced around shutting down immigrant detention facilities that were being used by the Trump administration. And it was started by a group of Japanese Americans who themselves had been incarcerated, most of them as children during World War II. So I'll show a short clip of some of those early actions in summer of 2019, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in the few years since then. So give me 1 second to get this queued up.
And we're here today to say, this must stop now! Immigrants are welcome here, no hate, no fear. Immigrants are welcome here, no hate, no fear. Immigrants are welcome here, no hate.
We're here because back in 1942, 700 Japanese immigrants were held. They were community leaders, separated from their family. Among them, there were 90 Buddhist priests arrested right after Pearl Harbor because they were thought to be a threat to national security. Cranes made by Japanese American community members around the country to support what all of you are doing here. Cranes folded very carefully by also Buddhist communities and temples around the country, 5,000 cranes.
This is the time of the year when our community celebrates our ancestors, because we all understand the power of our ancestors, because our ancestors were standing with us today at the gate at Fort Sill. They were with us. This is a chance for us to use the power of community to heal intergenerational trauma.
Who can belong? Who's included? Who's excluded? These are struggles that are interlinked between what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II and what is happening today. And we remember these people because usually their names are forgotten. And so we recite them today in our prayer.
Chief White Bear, Kiowa, Geronimo, Apache Chief, Woman's Heart, Kiowa Chief.
I am a grandson of Mexican immigrants that crossed the borders long before visas and green cards. And like every immigrant, they came to this country seeking a better life for themselves and for their children and for their grandchildren. Today we honor those Japanese internees that died here at the hands of our government in 1942, and to the 10 children whose lives were cut short while in custody of the U.S. Border Patrols.
So that was just a little taste of an action from 2019. And since then, Tsuru has really expanded sort of how we're thinking about Japanese American incarceration history and its legacy to today, to really think about it as a call to stand against all forms of incarceration and detention in the United States and seeing those as really interlinked processes, and to sort of use our community's history and working in sort of partnership with other communities of color in a project of racial healing, and seeing that as sort of a multi-generational project that can best be enacted through direct action and solidarity work. And I'll just sort of close by explaining the word tsuru in Tsuru for Solidarity. So tsuru is the Japanese word for crane. And so one of the ways that we often mobilize is by folding and then taking paper cranes in our actions with us. I'll maybe figure out a way to put a link in the chat or somewhere with more information. I think the Tsuru for Solidarity website was already dropped in. But if you're interested in sort of learning about more of what we do and the ways that we're working now, feel free to check out our website.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for coming and being with us and being in partnership with us and doing the amazing work of Tsuru for solidarity. Thank you. Our next esteemed guest is Delbert Richardson, who is an ethnomuseumologist, a community scholar, and a second-generation storyteller who has developed a unique multi-sensory hands-on pedagogy that brings attention to the false narratives that dominate American and global histories. His ongoing project, the national award-winning American History Traveling Museum, The Unspoken Truth, utilizes authentic artifacts, storyboards, and the ancient art of storytelling to teach history and educate participants of all ages. I will add that Delbert has spent the last 5 days installing an amazing transformational show at King Street Gallery in Seattle that will where he will share all of his priceless artifacts for the rest of us to learn and grow with. Welcome, Delbert, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Tilman and Lisa and Ilsa for being a part of. And on my screen, there's all 4 of us and Sarah and Brittany's avatars to the right. So yeah, I have to take a deep breath because I'm not really happy to be here, to be honest with you. And Tilman and Ilsa know me well, and I'm always grateful when they invite me to a space because that's a sign of courage, because I speak from the heart. And Lisa, thank you so much for sharing more about your organization. And I learned a lot about you and that continual struggle that Black and Brown people take on just to be valued and seen. So I want to thank you. So the American History Travel Museum, The Unspoken Truth, is a national award-winning museum. And it's really centered around, and I have Delbertisms, right? So, you can quote these and I'm not sure if they're written down, but he who tells the story controls the narrative. So if we can all agree that the majority of history has been told through the lens of white men, we can give a finger snap, right? Now, that don't mean it's good or bad. They're just other stories that have not been told. And so my work is primarily geared toward children and young adults in elementary school, primarily Black and in BIPOC children. And I always say Black because I operate from a belief that in that term BIPOC, we're also marginalized, because a lot of times what the white male dominants will do, they'll pit us against each other. But the reality is there's this term called universal targetism that I think is Professor Powell. It basically says, if you focus on those groups of individuals at the bottom rung of society and you uplift them, everybody will benefit. So that's why I started with Black people. So museums broke up into 4 sections. I teach American history, but I start with Mother Africa. Its second section is American chattel slavery. Third section is Jim Crow era. And the 4th section, one of the most important sections, is Still We Rise. And in every single section, there's authentic artifacts or items that one can touch, because I believe our children learn faster and quicker kinesthetically. So how I came to this place of my museum is my story. Being born in 1954, and I was born either a Negro or colored or both. So I didn't have any exposure to Black history in elementary, middle, or high school. So the only story I've been told is through the lens of the oppressed. And by going to University of Washington, I was exposed to some different information that challenged perceptions and beliefs that I had been exposed to that had me start thinking about, why didn't I know that? I didn't know that. And how come I didn't know that? right? And so the museum is really an opportunity for us to do some work around self-discovery. And so in closing, Tilman and Ilsa is two of my favorite white women, right? For two reasons. Number one, I've worked with both of them extensively, but the other reason is they identify as racist. And that's critically important for Delbert, right? Because they get it that it's not about being good or bad. It's about that I understand that I am part of a culture of whiteness that have unearned privilege and entitlement because of the color of my skin. So when I say I'm a racist, I'm just saying I'm get it. And so I've grown to this place to where I don't really want to work with anybody white doesn't call himself a racist, because it's too much work for me to help them guide themselves internally. And this is what I believe Tilman and Ilsa really want to do by this book, is create stories for them to enter their own journey of self-discovery. Because see, I don't have a right to call you a racist, right? What I can do is share with you, based on my extensive research, what I've learned in my lived experience, how the culturalization of whiteness impacts all of us. And so, like I said, I'm always grateful to show up when Tilman and Ilsa in the room, because I know I have not an ally, not an advocate, but an abolitionist. And what that says is they're willing to risk it all for humanity, not Blackness, for humanity. So I'm always, always glad to be in the presence of these two white women.
Thank you so much, Delbert, and for sharing that, for sharing from the heart. And Lisa, thank you for sharing that video to just really ground us in a sense and the feeling of what you do, right? And we're hoping together to have some deep conversation, and just the way that you two open really set the stage for that, and I appreciate that. And so I'm going to offer a question to all of us to engage around, and also want to say, at any point that Lisa or Delbert, you have questions for us that you're wondering, hey, well, what's your take on this? Let's have a conversation, and let's go a little bit deeper around it. I know that both of you do work that puts what's happening today in regards to social justice and racial justice and racism and white supremacy in a historical context. And so I'm curious, just, given the work that you do, what connections do you make between that and the role of white women?
Lisa, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I think for me, I previously sort of placed the Japanese American incarceration history into this broader history of incarceration and carceral systems. And I think that's deeply rooted in white womanhood, and the notion, a sort of perception across many centuries of US history about what is safety, and what is safety particularly for white women, or what is safety that is needed to protect white women. And so I think, just within Asian American history, so much of particularly 19th and early 20th century Asian immigration laws to the United States were about this sort of fear of Chinese and Japanese and Filipino immigrants, and especially in their possibility of intermarriage with white women or having children, both just having children in general, which is sort of its own thing, but then, this a special sort of specter that they might sort of contaminate whiteness, which led to, the first set of racialized immigration policies in the US in the 1890s, 1904, and then the 1924 Immigration Act. And I think even the way that, a system of mass incarceration has changed over US history, to me, that is deeply invested in a process of safety, and safety that's implicitly a safety that sort of keeps white women, white families protected from an unspoken or unspeakable racial other. So that's, I guess, how I would maybe start that off. But Delbert, I would be really interested in hearing your response.
Well, from a standpoint of, and I believe Ilse, you talk about something about the role of white women. Is that what you said? What's the question again?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
how's your work? Yeah.
Great. So my work is really about providing information that hopefully will assist white women to see the culture by which they exist and how they show up in a way and they're not even aware sometimes. And so, when I look at your book on page Roman numeral 13, and it's from Dr. Shakti Butler, let's read one sentence. It says, Carolyn Bryant, a white female, generated the lie resulting in a young person's brutal murder. So the first question comes up, and this is where my work comes in, is what was going, not why did Carol Bryant lie? What's going on with her to where she felt that a lie was necessary at this point in time to sacrifice the body of someone else for a benefit, not for the benefit, for a benefit. And so my work, and I have an image of, in the museum of Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin. And I asked the question, is there a difference? And so one of the things I always try to do is create questions in the museum experience that assist people with start doing that internal work that hopefully will challenge longstanding beliefs and perceptions. So when I look at the roles of white women, and I think it was Sarah that read the opening piece about white women as far back in the enslavement period and Jim Crow and even present day, there's still, in my view, there's still this wanting of validation of white women to white male dominance. And so my work, real simply, is to put information out that creates a healthy space for difficult feelings for white women. And the goal is hopefully they'll want to find that piece around identifying as a racist so the real work can start.
Yeah. I was thinking, Lisa, as you were sharing about just when I first learned that the first time that white shows up in any US law or policy, and whiteness is a political construction. Let's be clear about this. It's an intentional political construction. It's an anti-miscegenation laws forbidding white women particularly from engaging in sexual relations, like you were saying, with folks of color. And I think that that's, and in marital relations. And of course, white men controlling white women, white women's marital relations, and then controlling racial, so-called racial purity through that, right? Yeah, I mean, Delbert, we could go on about Carolyn Bryant, right? And just that, and that brings up for me, just where do I see that? Where does Carolyn Bryant live in me, right? Where does that live in me, that desire to say, well, I need to have control over this Black man's body, this Black boy's body. And I need to lie and make up a story or shift the truth to protect my innocence, to protect my goodness. And now throughout my life, I've been really invested as a white woman in protecting my goodness, so much so that when I first experienced something like your museum, my desire is to just crumble or become defensive rather than stay in it.
Ilsa, I think both of these organizations, certainly Delbert, my experience with your museum, Lisa, the honored moments I've spent at the Minidoka incarceration camp, both have brought up those feelings with me. And I think it's because it is in direct contradiction with the messages I got that because I'm white and a white woman, that I am desirable, I am pure, I am innocent, and that I bought into those messages. But the reality is, what I was being taught was that because I was white, I was allowed and supposed to exploit certain people of color. And as a white woman, I was expected to be exploited by white men. So right there in the middle, right? So instead of self-reflecting or owning my behaviors that I developed because of being in the midst of those two realities, I exhibit behaviors that are harmful to all of us. And without, as you said, Delbert, much internal examination. It's just how things are done.
I want to just get into it here. Delbert, you said you weren't happy to be here. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I'm happy to be here with you, but the subject matter is triggering, right? When I look at white women's roles as it relates to Black bodies, you guys are a threat.
Yeah.
Excuse me. You represent a threat. That's important. Language is important, but you're not a threat. You represent a threat. So anytime this is a unhealthy screen for me. Number one, let me just say this: I may feel a little more comfortable if there was a Black woman on the screen, right? But it isn't. So, and I want to say this: Delbert's views and thoughts and ideas is not representative of all Black people. I want to say that right now, because unfortunately, and this is the way it is, I get called to a lot of places where I'm the only Black person. So I speak from the I standpoint, which is so important. So, but I have a responsibility to show up for my ancestors. So in my museum, I have real slave shackles, right? Real branding irons, all those tools of oppression that there are days when I want to just sell the things and give it away. But because of what my ancestors had to endure, for me to have this privilege, and I don't think that sometimes Black and brown people talk about the privilege. Lisa, I'm talking to you, because our ancestors paid a heavy price for us to have this opportunity. So how do we, I don't want to say pay them, how do we honor them? Where I show up in spaces where if I had my choice, I wouldn't be here. But I have a responsibility to speak for the voiceless. So Ilsa, thank you for asking me. And I get asked to come to spaces like this because people know my passion and my commitment. And I don't believe in shaming. I don't believe in blaming, because that impacts me more than anything. But what you will get from me is me to speak from that place of lived experience and what I've learned based on my research.
Thank you, Delbert. Lisa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I guess I would just completely echo what Delbert was saying about thinking multi-generationally or thinking across generations. I mean, I think that's something I do. I think that's something that Tsuru does. Last year during an event, I was reading something where the question was, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And so I think to me, that's just an interesting way of framing myself as sort of a generation between ancestors who come before and generations to come, and sort of thinking about, why show up to an event like this, or why show up to a direct action. Just, I think I'm resonating with what Delbert was saying. To me, it's about, what do we need to put in motion from the generations that have come before to generations that are not yet here. And I guess maybe trying to tie this into something that Tilman said earlier, I think one of the ways that I think about whiteness that's also sort of present in the book is an ideology of whiteness. And even often an unspoken ideology of whiteness, such that, it's not necessarily an overt thought of exploitation or an overt statement of exploitation, but that the default system is one in which ways of thinking and being in the world that are being taught to white children are the right ways. And one of those is sort of, that your safety matters in implicit and explicit ways. I think I'm someone who has mostly grown up in an era, a national security era, sort of a post 9/11 era. And to me, so much of the sort of subtext of that is about sort of a safety of whiteness against these fears of, brown immigrants, of brown terrorists, of all these sort of unsaid things. And there are just like small and really unconscious ways that kind of ideology, I think, has just permeated contemporary US life. And I think to me, that is whiteness. That is an ideology of whiteness. And so I think that's just something I've been thinking about in relationship to this conversation.
When you say that, Lisa, what comes up for me is, and I say this tongue in cheek, how helpful we are as white women. We're always there ready to help, right? And I'm certainly demonstrated that. And in many ways, my desire to help means I can control things and I can make them the way that make me feel comfortable, right? So I was wondering if we could have a little bit of a conversation about your experiences with helpful white women who want to help you in your lives, in your organizations, how that shows up and what the impact of our helping is.
Thank you. If I could, I want to go back to what Lisa said, if I can. She's talking about ideology of whiteness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If and when you come to the museum, you're going to see a term called the pathology of whiteness. Okay. To me, words are very important. And for those that may not understand when I say the pathology of whiteness, let me read you the Webster, that good old white man Webster, what he said, right? He said, the science of the cause and effects of diseases, right? So if we can agree that racism is a disease, then there's a pathology that goes with that. And so when we start thinking about the pathology of racism, and then when we talk about the ideology of racism, we really start, because to me, ideology is that thinking piece.
Yeah.
The pathology is how racism permeates. And one thing that I love to say is like, racism's like a mold. So if you, regardless of how healthy you go into a room, if you stay there long enough, you're going to be affected.
Mm-hmm.
So that pathology is so important. I just want to bring that point up because when Lisa talked about ideology, I said, oh boy, I want to share this because, I'm going down a place in terms of science or in terms of diseases that I think that, and I want to believe that, I think Seattle has passed something where racism is a public health hazard, just for those that don't understand. So anyway, so back to Tilman's question about, I think white women want to be helpful. I'm always concerned about motives of white women. Because if I don't know you, then my default is there's something you want to get out of it rather than really help me. Why is that? Because history has assured me, I have trust issues with white women. Now, what's important? I'm talking about a culture. I didn't say I have trust issues with Ilsa and Tilman. And my good friend, Dr. Caprice Hollins, we talk about this a lot, who happens to work with Ilsa. Regardless of how much we talk about culture, talk about the culture of whiteness, white people want to take it personal. And check it out. I'm not talking about you. So I just want you to know, I'm talking about a culture. So it makes it very difficult when it comes down to white people wanting to help, me lowering my guard enough to trust them that they're showing up for my best interest.
Yeah, I think within Tsuru, like it's a fairly Japanese American space. Recognizing that Japanese Americans are a very diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic community, like we don't have a lot of white women who we work with closely within Tsuru. And I think though, just decide if this is interesting to other people or not interesting to other people. I think for me, thinking within an Asian American community and organizing within an Asian American community, like one of the ideas that came up in the book is the idea of white women as a buffer. And I think Asian Americans have also sort of been positioned or pitted as a racial buffer in this pathology of whiteness. And I think some of the sort of behaviors like cultivating unnecessary senses of urgency or having control over decision making are behaviors that Japanese Americans have learned because they're behaviors that sort of get you shortcuts to power in a system that is dominated by white men. And so I think we are really working within Tsuru to like unlearn those behaviors and ways of being, because they are ultimately really harmful to ourselves. And they are sort of a way of maybe investing in this like really ultimately deeply damaging myth about America and about whiteness in America. And I think we're really trying hard to, make spaces and have conversations within the Japanese American community about sort of naming those things and then stopping doing those things. So I think that's one of the ways where I sort of see whiteness really come up within the work of Tsuru.
Tilman, when you asked the question about being helpful, it reminded me of when I first started really thinking about how whiteness shows up in me and how my white privilege has shown up. And I had watched the movie The Color of Fear, Lee Moon-hwa's fabulous movie, and it was just life-shifting for me because throughout my whole life, my identity as a white person had been normalized. And I think, Delbert, to your point, that's one of the reasons that I take it so personally when I would get feedback around my behavior as a white person, because I didn't see myself as a white person. And so I couldn't distinguish between you're talking about white people and you're talking about me personally, Ilsa. And so I took things as a personal attack or affront, and would probably frame it as attack, right? As if that was an arena of violence where I had to fight back rather than the real violence of racism that's being perpetuated. That said, when I first realized it and just started exploring this, my first reaction was to go and try to help. And the way that I thought that I could be helpful was to educate everybody else, and I'm wagging my finger at you, about your whiteness and your white privilege. And I remember having conversations with my parents where I was crying and talking to them about the racism that they were doing, right? And how bad that was. And I remember having conversations with other white people where I'd be like, well, you know what, the thing that you're missing is this. And it came from this sense of superiority, a deeply internalized sense of superiority that I had, that I was now shifting to white people. And I think that sometimes white progressives can be, like myself, can be some of the hardest people to work with in social justice, racial justice work. And Lisa and Delbert, you can tell me if I'm off on this, and please, point out anything that I'm missing this. In this self-righteousness that we show up in, and then we're tearing down all these white folks. And then there's a bunch of broken white folks lying around. And then who are they going to say, am I still a good person? Am I okay? Well, they go to you, right? They say, Lisa, tell me that I'm okay. Tell me that I'm still good. Because, Ilsa just tore me apart, right? And we actually end up creating more work for our colleagues of color when we show up in that way, that it's so familiar to me. And it's so easy for me to do that. So, yeah. I'm just curious if what your all reaction is to me sharing that, if you've seen that, or if there's, if there's any pieces that you think that we're missing, or Tilman, if you have, something that you wanted to add as well.
Let me just share this. White women are so injured, in my view, And here again, I didn't say Tilman, I didn't say Ilsa, I'm gonna say that. But if it's, and I say this when I do my trainings, if it's landing with you personally, let's talk about it, right? You know, this whole part of validation is historical.
Yeah.
It's historical. Not in the Americas. Let's go back to Europe. Okay. If you really want to learn, look up this term called Scold's bridle. SCOLD bridle. White men used to put these contraptions on white women's heads when they were disobedient and lead them around in public. Now, there weren't any Asian Americans, there weren't no Black or African Americans. So this whole notion of validation that white women are seeking is so ingrained, it's part of their own historical trauma. But now they've had this opportunity, keyword opportunity, to embrace this privilege as a white woman as it relates to white male dominance. They have, in a lot of ways, unconsciously been harming people that come into their space.
Delbert, I would love to think it was always unconscious. And that's how I love to think about myself, that I would never hurt you. I would never fill in the blank. I remember one time you and I were having a conversation and I was using an example. I said, gosh, you know, if my racism shows up, and you went, ha, if your racism shows up, when your racism shows up. And it was just right, just part of our conversation. Like, yes, like I am not exceptional. I am not the outside of the rule. I ingested this culture. I ingested the culture that says that I, because I'm white, know what's right. I also ingested the trauma and the injury that you talked about from my exploitation from white men. So for me to think that I just skirt through life with no impact on anybody is ridiculous. Of course I do. Even if I'm smiling all the time, I do it. So part of it, this book, is us doing what you're doing with your museum, is trying to encourage ourselves and white women and those who live with us to self-reflect, to reflect on how these behaviors show up and what we can do to change them, because they are harmful.
Tilman, you and Ilsa are the exceptions in my view, not the norm. So when I say unconscious, I'm saying for the most part, white women, in my view, they are. And so they don't have to think about anything other than the way they show up. So when you hear me say unconscious, I'm not even, in some cases, I'm not even sure they're even aware that their behavior adversely is impacting other people, because they haven't done any work for that to even to evolve. Mm-hmm. So I'll make it very clear, because I know for a fact, like Carolyn Bryant, she knew what she was doing by lying, right? But I just know that, you know, this whole thing about hard work can be exhausting. So that's what I call the work we're doing right here, hard work. Can we start working from the heart first? We can start getting to those places that are very, very uncomfortable to the self. And if you're out there and you're white, identify as white, you're not uncomfortable, and Delbert's view, you're not working hard enough. Because I'm uncomfortable every friggin' day. I run the risk every day when I leave my home of being murdered or being killed. And so for me, if you're not uncomfortable, you may want to think about working a little bit harder.
I would maybe want to pick up on the idea, I think from right at the beginning, about goodness, because I think that's something that is one of those things that's really uncomfortable to divest from a notion of goodness. And I think like a lot of the sort of work that Tsuru is doing in regards to sort of abolition around prisons and jails and detention sites is work that is being led by Black women in particular. And a lot of sort of I think one of the, I don't know, in some ways hardest, I think, things for me to really sit with in a what I think is sort of like a practice of abolition is the idea that there are good people and not good people. Because I think that there is sort of like the tantalizing possibility of salvation in goodness. And then if that goes away, then what is there? And I think that that's maybe one of those things that's sort of really hard to sort of reconcile for myself. How do I understand who I am if it is not in sort of a matrix of being good? And I think that's just, I think one of the things that I think this book is really pushing towards is making sense of yourself that is not in a framework of goodness.
Mm. Thanks for that, Lisa. That's something that we've, had a lot of conversations about, and hard conversations about how often as white women we frame our work in anti-racism as, I'm either racist or I'm a good person, in that good bad binary, rather than, I'm racist or I'm engaged in anti-racism work. Like the opposite of racist is not good, it's anti-racist. And so how do we just recognize that really doesn't have to do with our goodness, and stop striving for goodness, because then that just centers us in the conversation. And I saw that there's quite a few questions that have come in, and I'm wondering how you all feel about bringing in some of the questions from the audience here.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Well, Delbert, I'm uncomfortable. No, it was an amazing conversation. So many things are coming up for me as I listen, and realizing how so much of my own identity was tied since being a little girl with the idea of having to be good, and you strive so hard to be good and sit in class and listen and be a good daughter, all of these things, and just to take that away from your identity and pull that apart is a lot of work, but it's exciting, and just so much resonation with what Delbert said about just saying I'm a racist, and just the power in that. And so I just really, really appreciate everybody here taking the time to share their hard-won work and information, and being willing to speak up and share it. So thank you, first of all, for all of that. And I know my brain will be buzzing for a long time about all of this. So thank you. So I do want to get to some of the questions that have come in. And we are grateful to people that have submitted. I'll start from the top. This is coming from Jude, and they say they haven't read the book, but I'm thinking about the fact that both presenters are presenting activist work that by necessity they are doing, and thank you for so graciously sharing it without shaming. What do our speakers and moderators see as concrete actions, given so much of this history is at least partially known? So i.e. the work racist white women must do and commit to.
Buy the book. I'm serious. If this and I'm not sure if the person that asked that question is white or not, but if you are, I strongly suggest you buy the book, because this work is around self-discovery. I cannot say that enough. I can't point you to what you should do or shouldn't do, but there are tools out there. And Tilman and Ilsa have, I believe, constructed a toolkit based on a lived experience to assist you on your journey. And so when you come to my museum, it's also another opportunity to reflect and to really get into some self-work.
Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I would just say, support the work that Tsuru for Solidarity is doing in addition to what Delbert said, right? And when we're engaged in anti-racism work, in social justice work, showing up with rather than to or for somebody can really help to keep us in check around that paternalism that I mentioned earlier. And the other thing that I would say is that recognize that as we're showing up with people, that it's for our own liberation, it's for our own humanity. It's not to end mass incarceration. It's not to help Black people. It's not to help brown people. This is with all of us. Like, this is what's necessary for all of us to get free. And in that, I think that it's important for us white women to continually, as Delbert said, be doing the deep questioning of how am I showing up? And how is this showing up in my body as well as in my mind? Because how I think about things is not always aligned with how my body shows up. And that's a part of the pathology of whiteness.
Should I move on to the next question? Okay, so this is a bit of a three-parter. So maybe I'll present the whole question and then we can look at it in pieces. This is, oh, the people are putting in more questions, so they're getting bumped. Can the author and publishers outline the process of how these two organizations came to support this book? Did the organizations have the opportunity to review and influence the content? And did NSP work with a non-white editor prior to publishing? So do you want to start with how the organizations came to support the book?
Well, I won't speak for the organizations. I'll let Delbert and Lisa speak to that piece. I can explain our invitation to both the Unspoken Truths Museum and to Tsuru for Solidarity, where we wanted to have our proceeds go to organizations led by people of color. So we asked if they would be open to having that relationship, because we knew that by having that relationship, it would be inferred that they supported us. And so what we did was we asked each one of them if they were interested. We sent the book to them before it was completed so they could see what they were assenting to partner with. And we absolutely took their feedback and whatever they had to share with us. We'll talk about that last part in a minute, but that's how the relationship began. Lisa or Delbert, do either of you want to add to that, or Ilsa?
I can share real simply. There's a certain level of, this is to who posed the question, and this is Delbert. There's a certain level of trust I have with Tilman and Ilsa, excuse me. This is important, a certain level of trust, because I'm not sure if I will, as them being white, I'll ever have that level of trust that comes from my historical memory, okay? But there's a certain level of trust to whatever they do, I'm in. And here's the other piece. Dr. Shakti Butler wrote the foreword, okay? Vetting. She would not write that foreword based on what I know of her unless there's a certain value associated with these two women. And so I'm just gonna make it real clear. I vet almost everyone I do business with. I have to. And so I'll ride to the sunset with these two, plus Dr. Shakti Butler.
If I could just quickly add, I think the middle question here, no, like we did not work on this book together. And I think that's okay, right? Like, I don't think, like, this is not a book for me. And I think that's okay. And I think it's okay that I did not influence the book. I think, like, the book to me, and I don't know Ilsa and Tilman, it's been great to meet them virtually a few times. The book seems to be a reflection of a group of white women in conversation with each other. And so if I sort of see Tsuru as a space that is primarily by and for Japanese Americans, I think of this book as a book primarily by and for white women. And ultimately, you know, I think it makes sense that the authors of this book are white women.
Thanks, Lisa. Ilse?
I just wanted to add onto the piece, and then Sarah, you could speak specifically from the perspective of the publisher, and that a New Society made clear to us that they wanted us to send the book to other people to read it and give us feedback on the content, that they were going to do more like, and you can, just more of like the editing, proofreading kind of a look at it. And that, you know, in any organization, it's good to know, like, yeah, we're experts in this, or no, that's like beyond the area of our expertise, and we're going to need you to do that legwork. And so Tilman and I were very intentional about sending the book to many people from different backgrounds and asking them to read and give us feedback. And we've had some really hard conversations, particularly with Black women, around the content of the book, and it was changed as a result. And so I totally agree with what you're saying, Lisa. Like, I think that white people need to be shouldering the responsibility of doing work with other white people and not leaving that solely on the shoulders of people of color. And I think that it's important that as we're doing this work, we are checking ourselves along the way, because we will inevitably miss stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a marketing manager, I'm not an editor, so I come into the process later, but I would reiterate what you say in that, you know, we can't be experts in everything. And so we do look to our authors to have their work vetted. Obviously, we go through the manuscript and there's fact checking and there's those sorts of things. And if that was a necessity or a request, we would have gone to find an editor that was Black. But that said, it's sort of like, we are a nonfiction publisher, so we would not recommend somebody send us their children's book, because that's not our area of expertise. So in this case, it's a nonfiction work, but we can't be experts in all of the different genres or subject matters that we publish, but we support. I hope you feel supported in the work that you do to make sure that you're handing in a manuscript that you feel proud of and that is representative of your work as well. So, but yes, as I'm not an editor, I can't speak directly too closely to that. So another question that came in is from Allison. What do you think about the self-interest of white people in racial equity work? Does that have a place, the own liberation of white people? So,
I feel that Ilsa kind of referenced this earlier, that we don't do this to try to save and Delbert or Lisa or Tsuru or any people of color. I've definitely been in parts of my life where I was that savior, I will save the day. But as soon as I shifted to this history of racialized behavior, of racism, white supremacy, of sexism, patriarchal violence, hurts me. And so when Ilsa, MG, and I got together, the whole point of it was, wow, what are people of color seeing in us? What injury do they see in us that we are not owning? Because we believe them, we know it's there. Why can we not see it and name it? So this book is literally a love letter to our white sisters and an invitation to please understand the injury that we have experienced and the vision and possibility of liberation or working towards liberation. So it is very much self-interested, because we feel if we are healthier and more whole, then we are going to cause less harm.
I think that speaks somewhat to the next question from Noni about, she says, this is a powerful conversation. What is your hope for this book, and how do you hope to impact the reader? And I think that you touched on that well there. But was there anything else you'd like to add about how you're hoping the reader would be impacted from the book?
Can I tell what I would hope the reader of this book is that they, number one, embrace the fact, this is a Delbertism, that if you identify as somebody of European descent or white, that you're a racist. See what I'm saying? You're a racist. And it's not from a place of shame and guilt. It's from a place of, right? Heavy sigh. And so let me just share, I was in a workshop not too long ago, and Tilman was there, and it was the pastor of a church. And we were doing reflections at the end, and she said, thank you guys so much. And she said, I finally have gotten it, that I'm a racist. And she said it just like that. So that will be one of my hopes from white women reading this book, or white men for that matter, is that they just start embracing the fact that, that in my view, you're not a bad person, but you are a racist.
Well, it's that piece of owning it, I think. I mean, I do that with my son in terms of if he does something that he knows, say, isn't appropriate, and deflects it, that it, oh, well, I did that because of so-and-so. If you don't own it, you never change it, because it's always somebody else has made you do it, or some system is there, and so I did it. And so it's when you own it, I think, is when you can make those changes. If you don't own it, you're constantly, I don't know, not seeing it, passing it off. Somebody asked, Christy asked, what white, you touched on this a little bit, Delbert, in including men, but what way white men might benefit from reading this book.
Yeah. Christy, you should have a conversation with my dad about that, because he's sharing some thoughts with me about how he's benefiting. I think that a lot of white men look at it and they think, oh, well, this isn't for me. I think that white men should ask yourselves, how do you benefit from having white women situated in this buffer between you and people of color? In what ways have you been insulated by the position of white women? In what ways have you shared Karen videos and laughed at them and belittled them? And are you aware of how that has insulated you in your perpetuation of white male supremacy? And so I think that having that analysis, having that understanding of the fact that when we're talking about what's up with white women, we can't have that conversation without talking about white male power. We can't have that conversation without talking about white patriarchy and white male supremacy, because that is primarily the way in which white women are accessing our privilege. So that means that we are often capitulating to that. And we hope that white men will also start to take a look at that and question that and think about, how have I been complicit, or even and how have I supported these systems? The other thing that I would recommend, and I saw one other question references Ijeoma Oluo's work, is read Mediocre by Ijeoma Oluo, because she really clearly lays out the role of white men and the dangerous legacy of white men.
Can I speak to buffering real quick? And it just takes me back through a historical lens. You think about this, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, right? And you look at how white men have created this buffer. Look at all the white women in decision-making capacity in organizations, right? So the Civil Rights bills were passed primarily so Black people could have rights. White women benefited from that more than anyone else. And it was allowed by white men. Why? So they can have that buffer between us and them.
Delbert, that's what, I guess that's the patriarchal bargain, right? That we as white women have made. It's like, we will put up with being the buffer because it accesses white privilege for us. We'll put up with enforcing rules and laws that you create, even if they harm us, because we get this idea that access to whiteness is what really matters. And that causes behaviors that are really problematic, especially if unexamined.
One of the like, not a huge through line, but something in the book that I've just been sort of thinking about in relationship to a few other things recently is like, to me, part of the myth of whiteness is sort of a myth of being cultureless. And sort of this idea that, like, you know, you don't have an ethnic identity, or you don't have cultural practices. And I think that like is interesting in context of white womanhood, because I think in a lot of ways, you know, academics, anthropologists, people who study culture would say in patriarchal societies, culture generally is sort of taught by mothers, and sort of passed often matrilineally. And I think therefore sort of one of the, not sort of taken up in this book, but I think one of the ways that sort of men are part of this is in having white mothers, and sort of the role of white women as mothers in raising white men and white children in general. And therefore then passing on sort of this notion of being cultureless. And what would happen if we could sort of have different ways of understanding whiteness, and historicizing whiteness, because I think you know, there are several sort of whiteness scholars who've talked about like the creation of whiteness as a category that can sort of include ever increasing groups of people for different political advantages within the history of the United States. And part of that inclusion is this process of deculturation. And so sort of what can happen in white communities with a rehistoricization and sort of a return to abandoned cultural practices that were given up for the sake of investments in whiteness. And I not necessarily like a fully formed thought, but just wanted to offer that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lisa, you bring up something that I have incorporated in the museum. I have a board that's called Complicity, right? And so there's these signs, and we all know the signs that says no colored allowed, no Irish allowed. But a lot of people don't know that in the early 30s and 40s, there was no Germans, no Italians, and no Polish, right? So when you talk about culture, those groups had a rich culture. And listen, they still do, but they're making an active decision to, and so the question becomes, you know, what have they been willing to give up or unown for the purpose of a privilege that comes with this term called whiteness, which is a culture that's been created to marginalize other people.
Mm-hmm.
I find that a fascinating conversation, just that piece of the idea of what you give up to be white and what that looks like for that privilege of being white and the culture that you leave behind for that. We do have one more question. Do we have time for that?
I'm good. Yeah.
From Ten Mayo. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. When I pass people of color on the street, I want to smile at them, but I feel patronizing. Can you help me explain the situation and how to resolve my feeling and how it is received?
I want to read a section in the book that's directly related to this. So Joanna is one of our focus groups members, and as we say, this example demonstrates how quickly our minds and responses are keyed up to try to connect with people of color, even when we aren't being authentic. Joanna went on to explain how she could easily recognize a parallel example when people were trying to connect with her as a queer woman. I try to say hi to people of color in white spaces. I just say hi. I'm not sure if they're on to me. I know where I'm coming from, but I'm not sure of the impact. However, I can see the impact when my wife Jill and I are walking around and we're holding hands. We see people wanting to acknowledge us and let us know they are not homophobes. We think it's cute. We're on to straight folks doing it. So cute. They have such big smiles. And I just think that like this idea of like, oh, you know, we're just going to like smile and make you feel good. And there is something I believe about, you know, you're in community and you don't want people to feel like they're unwelcome in the community, right? And I'm curious to see, you know, or to hear just a minute or two of Delbert and Lisa, if you had a reaction to that question.
So what I believe I heard was that somebody said that they wanted to smile, but there's some concern about patronage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'm into heart work, right? So what's wrong with walking by somebody and smiling as a term of acknowledgement, rather than is there a motive behind me making that gesture?
Mm.
So I think sometimes white people try so hard to a detriment to think about what they're doing rather than just allowing themselves to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you all so much for the conversation tonight.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. This has been amazing. We appreciate everybody's time and willingness to share with us. I will announce that Lisa was our winner of the book giveaway. And so Brittany will be in touch with you to get your contact information. To people who did not win the book, that you can still use the coupon code women25 at newsociety.com for 25% discount. I also want to thank Brittany, who's working behind the scenes on all of our technical pieces. So thank you very much, Brittany, for all of your hard work. Our next event is November 18th, and we'll be talking about individual climate action versus systemic change with Lloyd Alter and Sammy Grover. And you can follow us on Eventbrite or sign up for a newsletter to find out, to register for that event. And we just thank everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. And we really thank everybody for spending the time with us today.
Thanks to everybody. And Lisa and Delbert, thank you so much for being here with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.